What would you do if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about your family was a lie? That the woman who raised you after your father's death had been manipulating not just your emotions, but your entire future? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 6 months ago, I thought I had lost everything when my stepmother sold my childhood home behind my back. But what the lawyers uncovered in that old house didn't just make her cry. It changed everything I believed about my father, my family, and myself. This is the story of how a betrayal led to the most shocking discovery of my life.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I believed I was just another struggling 24-year-old trying to make it in Portland, Oregon. I worked double shifts at a local coffee shop, shared a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, and spent my evenings studying for my paralegal certification. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and I was proud of slowly building something for myself. The house on Maple Street had been my anchor through it all. Even though I hadn't lived there since starting college, knowing it was still there, still ours, gave me a sense of security I didn't realize I needed. It was a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch built in 1978. Nothing fancy, but it had been home for 18 years of my life. My father, David Mitchell, had bought that house when he was just 25, fresh out of his apprenticeship as an electrician. He used to tell me stories about how he'd saved every penny for 3 years to afford the down payment, eating nothing but ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. "This house represents every dream I ever had, Sarah," he'd say, running his calloused hands along the wooden banister he'd refinished himself. "Someday, it'll represent yours too." Dad died when I was 19, just as I was finishing my first year at Portland Community College. A massive heart attack at 47, no warning, no goodbye, just there one day and gone the next. The grief nearly destroyed me. He wasn't just my father, he was my best friend, my mentor, my biggest supporter. After my biological mother abandoned us when I was 7, Dad had been everything to me. That's when Patricia Holloway entered our lives. Patricia was Dad's coworker at Brennan Electric, where she worked in the office handling payroll and scheduling. She was 42, never married, with perfectly styled auburn hair and a wardrobe that seemed too expensive for someone working at a small electrical company. She started bringing casseroles to our house after Mom left, offering to help with household tasks, always seeming to appear exactly when we needed someone. "She's just being kind, sweetheart," Dad would say whenever I expressed discomfort about Patricia's increasing presence in our lives. "Not everyone has ulterior motives." I was 12 when they married in a small ceremony at City Hall. Patricia became my stepmother overnight, moving into our house with her collection of ceramic angels and her insistence that everything needed to be more sophisticated. The warm, lived-in feeling of our home gradually disappeared, replaced with matching throw pillows and artificial flower arrangements. Patricia wasn't cruel. She was something worse. She was strategically indifferent. She never yelled at me or punished me unfairly, but she had a way of making me feel like an inconvenience in my own home. When I got accepted to college, she suggested I take out student loans instead of using Dad's education savings. When I struggled with my first job, she reminded me that some people just aren't cut out for certain things. Every interaction was designed to make me smaller, to convince me that I was lucky to have her tolerance. But Dad adored her. Patricia had a gift for being exactly what people needed her to be in the moment. Around my father, she was supportive, loving, interested in his work and his dreams. She'd massage his shoulders after long days, cook his favorite meals, and listen intently as he talked about upgrading the house's electrical system or adding a workshop in the garage. "I never thought I'd find love again after your mother," he confided in me once, about a year after the wedding. "Patricia makes me feel like the man I used to be." I learned to keep my reservations to myself. Dad was happy, and after years of raising me alone, he deserved that happiness. I focused on school, on building my own life, on creating distance between myself and Patricia's subtle manipulations. When Dad's heart attack happened, Patricia transformed overnight. The grief seemed genuine. She cried at the funeral, clutched my hand during the service, and spoke beautifully about Dad's kindness and work ethic. For a brief moment, I thought maybe we could find common ground in our shared loss. I was wrong. 2 weeks after the funeral, Patricia sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where Dad had helped me with homework for years, and explained the reality of our situation. She inherited the house along with most of Dad's assets. There was a small college fund set aside for me, enough to finish my degree, but everything else belonged to her. "Your father wanted to make sure I was taken care of," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're young, Sarah. You have your whole life ahead of you. I'm 54 years old. This is all I have."
I was too shocked to argue effectively. In my grief-stricken state, it seemed reasonable enough. Dad had always been practical, always worried about providing for the people he loved. Of course he'd want to ensure Patricia's security. But something felt wrong. Dad had always talked about the house as our legacy, something he was building for our family. He'd spent countless weekends teaching me basic electrical work, showing me how to repair things, making plans for renovations we'd do together when you're older. The idea that he'd simply leave it all to someone he'd known for less than 8 years felt inconsistent with everything I knew about him. Still, I didn't fight it. I was 19, drowning in grief, and Patricia had legal documents that seemed to support her claims. I moved into a dorm, finished college with the help of loans and part-time jobs, and tried to build a life separate from the complicated emotions surrounding my childhood home. Patricia and I maintained a cordial but distant relationship. She'd invite me for holidays, and I'd politely attend, sitting in what used to be my living room while making small talk about my job and her book club. She redecorated extensively. Dad's favorite leather recliner disappeared, along with most of the family photos and the workshop tools he'd carefully organized in the garage. The house became a showplace rather than a home, but it was her right to change it however she wanted. Or so I thought. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was rushing to get ready for work. Patricia's voice was crisp and businesslike, with none of the artificial warmth she usually maintained during our interactions. "Sarah, I wanted to let you know that I've decided to sell the house," she announced without preamble. "The market is good right now, and I'm ready to downsize. I'm moving to Arizona to be closer to my sister." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "Sell the house? But Dad, your father is gone, Sarah. I need to think about my future now. I've already accepted an offer from a young couple. We close next month." The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes. Patricia fielded my shocked questions with practiced responses that sounded like she'd rehearsed them. Yes, she'd gotten a fair price. No, she didn't need my input since the house was legally hers. Yes, she understood I had sentimental attachment, but sentiment didn't pay for retirement. When I hung up, I sat in my tiny kitchen feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Losing Dad had been devastating, but losing the house felt like losing him all over again. Every memory I had of him was tied to those rooms, that yard, the workshop where he'd taught me to use tools and dream about the future. My roommate, Jessica, found me crying over my untouched breakfast 20 minutes later. "I can't believe she didn't even discuss it with you," Jessica said, rubbing my back as I sobbed into my hands. "I mean, legally she might not have to, but morally? That house is part of your history too." "She never cared about what it meant to me," I managed between tears. "Dad used to talk about passing it down someday, about how it would be there for his grandchildren. She's just erasing all of that." Jessica, who was studying pre-law at Portland State, suggested I at least consult with a lawyer to understand my options. Even if you can't stop the sale, maybe there's something you can do. Some way to ensure you get a few of your dad's personal belongings, or at least time to say goodbye to the place properly. I knew she was right, but part of me worried that fighting Patricia would only make things worse. What if she decided to cut me out of her life entirely? She was my last connection to Dad, even if it was an uncomfortable one. What if I was just being emotional and unrealistic about something that was ultimately her legal right? But as the days passed and the reality of losing my childhood home sank in, I realized I couldn't just let it go without trying. This wasn't just about property or money, it was about preserving some piece of the life Dad and I had built together, some acknowledgement that his dreams and plans had mattered. I made an appointment with a local attorney named Marcus Chen, using some of my carefully saved money to pay for a consultation. I figured he'd probably tell me there was nothing I could do. But at least I'd know I'd tried. I had no idea that decision would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my stepmother, and my father's final wishes. As I sat in that lawyer's office explaining my situation, I was just a heartbroken daughter trying to hold on to her last connection to her dad. I had no idea I was about to discover the truth.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Marcus Chen's law office occupied the third floor of a converted brick building in downtown Portland, the kind of place that tried to look prestigious on a budget. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and leather furniture that had seen better days, but Marcus himself impressed me immediately. He was probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every family tragedy imaginable. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said, settling behind his desk with a yellow legal pad. "Don't worry about what seems relevant or not. Sometimes the details that feel unimportant are the most crucial." I spent 45 minutes walking him through my family history, from my mother's abandonment through Patricia's arrival, Dad's death, and now the house sale. Marcus took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, legal documents, and my father's personality. "Did your father ever mention updating his will after he married Patricia?" Marcus asked. "Not directly, but he was always practical about that stuff. He made sure I knew where he kept important documents, talked about planning for the future. I just assumed," I trailed off, realizing how many assumptions I'd made during my grief-stricken teenage years. Marcus leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "Sarah, I want to be honest with you. In most cases like this, step-parents do inherit the majority of assets, especially when they were married for several years. But there are a few things about your story that raise questions." "Like what?" "Well, the timeline, for one. You said your father died suddenly 5 years ago, but Patricia just now decided to sell? That's unusual. Most people either sell immediately for financial reasons or hold on to property long-term for sentimental value. And the fact that she didn't give you any warning or opportunity to discuss it," he shook his head, "it suggests she might be in some kind of hurry." My heart jumped. "What kind of hurry?" "Could be anything. Financial pressure, new relationship, health issues. Or it could be that she's been planning this for a while and finally found the right opportunity." Marcus set down his pen and looked me directly. "Here's what I can do. I can request copies of your father's will and any related estate documents from the probate court. It's public record, so you have every right to see exactly what he left and to whom." "I never thought to look at those documents myself," I admitted, feeling foolish. "Most people don't. Grief makes everything feel overwhelming, and when someone you trust tells you how things stand legally, it's natural to accept their word." Marcus made another note. "I can also do some preliminary investigation into the property records, see when exactly Patricia became the sole owner, and if there were any unusual circumstances." "How much will this cost?" I asked, already mentally calculating my meager savings. Marcus quoted a fee that made my stomach drop, but he quickly added, "However, I'm willing to work on a contingency basis if we find evidence of any wrongdoing. If there's nothing there, you pay a minimal consultation fee. If we discover your stepmother has been less than honest about your father's intentions, we discuss a percentage of whatever we can recover." I agreed immediately. Even if the investigation turned up nothing, at least I'd know I'd tried everything possible. "One more thing," Marcus said as I was gathering my purse to leave. "I want you to think carefully about your father's behavior in the months before he died. Did he seem worried about anything? Did he mention making changes to legal documents or talk about ensuring you'd be taken care of? Sometimes people have premonitions about their health that they don't share directly. Driving home, Marcus's question echoed in my mind. Dad's last few months had been busy. He'd picked up extra work to save money for a family vacation we never got to take, and he'd been working on some kind of project in his workshop most evenings. I'd been so focused on college applications and part-time work that I hadn't paid much attention to his activities. But now that I thought about it, there had been something different about his demeanor. He'd been more affectionate than usual, making sure to hug me longer and tell me he was proud of me more frequently. He'd also been organizing his things, cleaning out closets, updating his address book, even digitizing old family photos. "I want to make sure everything's in order," he said when I teased him about his sudden organizational streak. At the time, I assumed he was just going through a midlife phase, maybe triggered by turning 47. Now I wondered if he'd sensed something was wrong with his health. 3 days later, Marcus called with news that made my hands shake. "Sarah, I need you to come in as soon as possible." His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear an undercurrent of excitement. "I've found some significant discrepancies in the probate records." I called in sick to work and drove straight to his office, my mind racing through possibilities. Marcus was waiting with a stack of legal documents spread across his desk and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sit down," he said gently. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be upsetting, but I want you to know that we have options." He handed me a copy of my father's will, dated just 2 months before his death. As I scanned the legal language, my confusion grew. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Marcus. "This says Patricia inherits the house and most assets, just like she told me." "Keep reading," Marcus pointed to a section I had missed. My eyes found the paragraph he was indicating, and I read it twice before the words sunk in.
Upon the death of Patricia Holloway Mitchell, or in the event that she remarries or cohabits with another party for more than 6 months, the property at 1247 Maple Street shall pass immediately and unconditionally to my daughter, Sarah Mitchell, along with all contents, improvements, and associated assets. I stared at the document, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This means your stepmother's inheritance was conditional," Marcus explained. "She was essentially a life tenant, not the true owner. The house was always meant to come to you eventually, and if she remarries or moves in with someone, it reverts to you immediately. But she never told me about this condition. She never mentioned it was temporary." Marcus's expression darkened. "That's not the only thing she didn't mention. I also pulled property records for the past 5 years. 3 months ago, Patricia filed paperwork to add someone named Robert Carlucci as a co-owner of the property. The filing lists him as her domestic partner." My mouth fell open. "She has a boyfriend? She's been living with someone?" "According to the county records, yes. Which means, legally speaking, she forfeited her right to the house the moment Mr. Carlucci moved in. The property should have reverted to you automatically." I felt dizzy. So when she sold the house, she sold property that wasn't legally hers to sell, Marcus finished. "Which makes this fraud, Sarah. Your stepmother has committed real estate fraud, and she's done it using your inheritance." The room seemed to spin around me. Everything I'd accepted about my situation, every assumption I'd made about Patricia's legal right to the house had been built on lies. She'd known exactly what Dad's will said, and she'd deliberately hidden the conditions from me. "What happens now?" I managed to ask. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "Now, we stop that sale before it closes, and we start asking some very serious questions about what else Patricia might have hidden from you." As he dialed the number for the title company handling the sale, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of Patricia's deception. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about 5 years of believing I had no rights, no claim to my father's legacy, no security beyond what I could build for myself.
But there was something else bothering me, a nagging question that Marcus's discoveries had raised. If Patricia had been willing to lie about the conditions of Dad's will, if she'd been secretly living with someone for months while planning to sell property that wasn't hers, what else might she have hidden? "Marcus," I said as he finished his call to halt the closing, "you mentioned investigating the contents of the house. What exactly did your father's will say about that?" Marcus flipped through the document until he found the relevant section. All contents, improvements, and associated assets. That's pretty broad language. It would include everything your father kept in the house. Personal belongings, tools, documents, everything. Patricia cleaned out most of his things years ago. She said she donated them to charity. Marcus's eyebrows rose. Did she provide you with receipts for those donations? Documentation of what was given away? No, I never asked. I was so overwhelmed with grief, I just trusted her judgment. "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, "I think we need to get inside that house before the new owners take possession. Your father's will gives you legal right to anything that was his, and if Patricia disposed of valuable items without your knowledge or consent, that would be theft," I finished, the reality hitting me like a physical blow. Marcus nodded grimly. "We need to move fast. I'm going to file for an emergency injunction to prevent the sale from completing, and I'm going to request immediate access to the property for inventory purposes. But Sarah, I need you to prepare yourself. If your suspicions about Patricia are correct, we might be looking at much more than real estate fraud."
As I left Marcus's office that day, my world had shifted completely. I was no longer the grieving daughter who'd lost everything. I was the victim of a calculated deception that had been years in the making. And somewhere in that house on Maple Street, there might be evidence of just how deep Patricia's betrayal really went. The next morning, Marcus called with news that made everything even more urgent. The judge had granted our request for immediate property access, but we had to act within 48 hours before the new owners took possession. "Meet me at the house tomorrow at 9 a.m., Marcus said. "And Sarah, bring someone with you for emotional support. Something tells me we're about to discover things that are going to be very difficult to process." I barely slept that night, my mind cycling through memories of Patricia and trying to piece together when her deception had begun. Every interaction we'd had over the past 5 years took on a different meaning now that I knew she'd been lying from the very beginning. I kept thinking about all the times she'd made subtle comments about my unrealistic expectations or how I needed to accept reality and move on. She hadn't been helping me cope with loss. She'd been gaslighting me into accepting theft. Jessica drove me to the house the next morning, sensing I needed moral support for whatever we were about to discover. As we pulled up to 1247 Maple Street, I felt a complex mix of emotions. The blue shutters had been repainted a trendy gray, and Patricia had installed modern landscaping that looked nothing like the wildflower garden Dad and I had planted together. Even the mailbox was different, sleek black metal instead of the wooden one Dad had carved by hand. "It looks like a completely different house," I murmured, staring at what had once been my home. Marcus was already waiting on the porch with a locksmith and a woman I didn't recognize. She was tall and professional-looking, with short brown hair and a camera bag slung over her shoulder. "Sarah, this is Rachel Torres," said Marcus as we approached. "She's a forensic accountant and a state investigator. Given what we've uncovered so far, I thought it would be wise to have a professional document everything we find." Rachel shook my hand with a firm grip. "I'm sorry about your situation, Sarah. Unfortunately, cases like yours are more common than people realize. Step-parents who abuse their position of trust, family members who exploit grief. It's a particular kind of cruelty." The locksmith finished working on the front door, and we stepped inside. I hadn't been in the house for over 6 months, and the changes Patricia had made were even more dramatic than I'd remembered. Gone were Dad's comfortable furniture, his collection of vintage electrical equipment catalogs, the family photos that had covered the mantelpiece. The living room looked like a page from a home decorating magazine. Beautiful, but sterile, with no trace of the warm, lived-in feeling the house had when Dad was alive. "Let's start with your father's workshop," Marcus suggested. "Based on the will, any tools or equipment he owned should still legally belong to you. We made our way to the garage, which Dad had converted into his workshop space. I expected to find it empty. Patricia had told me years ago that she had donated all his tools to a vocational school. But when we opened the door, I gasped. The workshop was exactly as Dad had left it. Every tool was in its designated place on the pegboard he'd built. His workbench held the same projects he had been tinkering with before he died. Even his coffee mug with "World's Greatest Dad" printed on the side sat next to his reading glasses, exactly where he'd always left them. "She told me she got rid of everything," I whispered, running my fingers along his familiar workbench. Rachel was already taking photographs, documenting every detail. She noted, "This represents thousands of dollars worth of professional-grade tools. Your stepmother deliberately lied about disposing of these items, and legally, she had no right to keep them from you." But Marcus had discovered something even more significant. In the corner of the workshop, partially hidden behind a tool cabinet, sat Dad's old filing cabinet. It was locked, but the key hung on a hook nearby, exactly where he'd always kept it. "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, I think it should be you who opens this." My hands shook as I turned the key. The filing cabinet contained Dad's personal papers, tax returns, insurance policies, receipts, and maintenance records for the house. But in the bottom drawer, I found something that made my heart race. A manila folder labeled "For Sarah" in Dad's distinctive handwriting. Inside the folder were documents I'd never seen before. The first was a letter addressed to me, written in Dad's careful script. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me and you've discovered the truth about the house. I've been having some chest pains lately, and though I haven't told Patricia, I suspect my heart isn't as strong as it used to be. I want you to know that everything I did was to protect your future, while also honoring my commitment to Patricia. The house was always meant to be yours, sweetheart. I structured the inheritance this way to give Patricia security while ensuring you'd eventually receive what you deserve. I never intended for her to hide this from you. If she has, I'm deeply sorry. Check behind the loose board in my bedroom closet. There are things there I want you to have." The letter was dated just 1 week before Dad's death. He knew something was wrong with his health, and he was planning for my future in ways I'd never imagined. "There's more," Marcus said, examining the other documents in the folder. "Look at this." He handed me a receipt for a safety deposit box at First National Bank, paid up for 10 years in advance. Clipped to it was a note in Dad's handwriting, Box 847, key hidden with other important things for Sarah's future. "A safety deposit box?" I stared at the receipt. "Patricia never mentioned this." "Which means she either doesn't know about it or she's been hiding this too," Marcus replied grimly. Rachel was documenting everything, but her expression grew increasingly concerned as she examined more of Dad's papers. "Sarah, your father was far more organized and financially sophisticated than your stepmother led you to believe. These records show he owned several pieces of rental property that generated income, had substantial savings accounts, and even owned shares in Brennan Electric where he worked." I felt dizzy again. Rental properties? Patricia told me Dad barely left enough money to cover the funeral expenses. According to these documents, your father was worth at least $400,000 when he died, Rachel said quietly, and none of this appears in the probate records your stepmother filed. The scope of Patricia's deception was becoming clearer, and it was far worse than I'd imagined. She hadn't just hidden the conditions of Dad's inheritance, she'd apparently hidden entire assets from the probate court. "We need to get into that bedroom closet," Marcus said, his voice grim, "and we need to get to that safety deposit box as soon as possible." Upstairs, Patricia had converted Dad's bedroom into a guest room, but the closet remained largely untouched. Behind hanging clothes, Marcus found the loose floorboard Dad had mentioned. Beneath it was a small metal box containing more documents, several $100s in cash, and most importantly, the key to the safety deposit box. But there was something else in the box that made my breath catch. A second letter from Dad, this one much longer and more detailed. "Sarah, if you found this box, it means you've discovered Patricia's deception. I'm writing this because I've begun to suspect she's not the woman I thought I married. Last month, I caught her going through my private papers when she thought I was asleep. When I confronted her, she claimed she was just trying to help organize my affairs, but something in her manner troubled me. I've started keeping track of things that don't add up. Money that's gone missing from our joint account, phone calls she takes in private, a man who's called the house several times asking for her, claiming to be from her book club, but I've never heard her mention his name. I don't want to believe the worst of her, but I've decided to protect your inheritance just in case. The safety deposit box contains copies of all my financial records, including assets she doesn't know about. There's also a second will there, one I had prepared by a different attorney in case I need to change my arrangements. The letter went on to detail Dad's growing suspicions about Patricia's motives and his careful steps to protect my future. It was clear he'd been planning to confront her about his concerns, but his death had come before he could act. "This changes everything," Marcus said, after reading both letters. "Your father suspected fraud before he died, and he took steps to document it. The safety deposit box is going to contain evidence that could expose the full extent of Patricia's crimes." As we prepared to leave the house, Rachel finished her documentation and handed me a memory card containing hundreds of photographs. "This proves that your stepmother lied about disposing of your father's belongings. Combined with the letters and financial documents, you have a strong case for recovering not just the house, but potentially substantial financial damages." But as we drove to the bank, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Dad's letters revealed a man who'd grown suspicious of his wife's behavior in his final weeks. If he'd had time to investigate further, what else might he have discovered? The safety deposit box was located in the basement vault of First National Bank. After providing identification and Dad's key, the bank employee led us to a small private viewing room where we could examine the contents. What we found inside made everything else pale in comparison. The box contained detailed financial records showing that Dad had accumulated far more wealth than anyone realized. There were deeds to 3 rental properties Patricia had never mentioned, bank statements showing accounts with substantial balances, and investment records documenting a portfolio worth nearly $200,000. But most shocking of all was a thick folder labeled Patricia Investigation. Inside were receipts for a private investigator Dad had hired just 1 month before his death, along with a report that revealed Patricia's true history. "Jesus," Marcus breathed as he read through the investigator's findings. "Sarah, your father discovered that Patricia was married before, twice. Both previous husbands died under mysterious circumstances, and she inherited substantial assets from both of them." The private investigator had uncovered Patricia's pattern of targeting older men with assets, marrying them, and benefiting from their deaths. There was evidence that she'd been in contact with someone named Robert Carlucci for months before Dad died, and that she'd been systematically hiding money in accounts Dad couldn't access. Most disturbing of all, the investigator had found evidence that Patricia might have been slowly poisoning Dad with digitalis, a heart medication that could cause cardiac arrest if given in the wrong doses to someone who didn't need it. As I sat in that sterile bank room surrounded by evidence of Patricia's calculated betrayal, I realized that Dad's sudden death might not have been natural at all. Patricia hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she might have murdered my father to get it. "We need to call the police," I said quietly. "This isn't just fraud anymore. This is something much worse." Marcus was already reaching for his phone, but his expression was troubled. "Sarah, this is going to get very complicated very quickly. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once we involve law enforcement, there's no going back." I looked at the evidence spread across the table. Proof of Patricia's lies, her crimes, and possibly her involvement in Dad's death. For 5 years, I'd accepted her version of reality, believing I was just a struggling young woman with no claim to my father's legacy. Now I knew the truth, and I was ready to fight for justice no matter how difficult the battle ahead might be.
Detective Ray Martinez arrived at the bank within 30 minutes of Marcus's call. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human greed and betrayal. As he examined the evidence we'd collected, his demeanor grew increasingly serious. "This is extensive," he said, photographing each document with meticulous care. financial fraud, possible identity fraud, and now potential homicide. We're going to need to exhume your father's body for toxicology testing. The words hit me like a physical blow. The idea of disturbing Dad's grave, of putting his body through medical procedures 5 years after his death, felt like a violation of everything sacred. But if Patricia had murdered him, we needed proof. "How long will all this take?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "The exhumation process alone could take weeks, depending on court approval and the medical examiner's schedule," Detective Martinez explained. "Meanwhile, we'll be building a case based on the financial evidence and the private investigator's report. But I need to warn you, Patricia's going to know we're investigating as soon as we start pulling bank records and interviewing witnesses." Marcus leaned forward. "What about the house sale? Can we still stop it?" "The fraud evidence gives us grounds to freeze the transaction," the detective replied, "but that's going to alert Patricia immediately. Once she knows we're onto her, she might try to flee or destroy evidence." As if summoned by our conversation, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia's name. "Don't answer it yet," Detective Martinez advised. "Let me set up a recording device first. Anything she says could be used as evidence." While the detective prepared his equipment, I tried to calm my racing heart. Patricia had no idea we'd discovered Dad's hidden evidence, but she was clearly suspicious about something. Maybe the title company had contacted her about the delayed closing, or maybe she'd somehow learned about our visit to the house. "Okay," Detective Martinez nodded. "Answer it, but try to keep her talking. See if you can get her to reveal anything about her current living situation or her relationship with Robert Carlucci." Marcus activated the speaker function and answered the call. "Patricia, this is Marcus Chen, Sarah's attorney." There was a brief pause before Patricia's voice came through, sharp with barely controlled anger. "Why has my house sale been delayed? The title company called saying there were legal complications that needed to be resolved." "We've discovered some discrepancies in the probate records. It appears there may have been some confusion about the terms of David's will." "There's no confusion," Patricia snapped. "David left everything to me. I have the will, I have the probate court's approval, and I have every right to sell my property." "Actually, Patricia, we need to discuss the conditional nature of your inheritance, specifically the clause about remarriage or cohabitation." The silence that followed was so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the artificial warmth she'd always used with me, replaced with something cold and calculating. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I'm not going to be intimidated by some small-time lawyer with delusions of grandeur. My sale will proceed as scheduled." "Patricia," I found myself speaking before I could stop myself, "we know about Robert Carlucci. We know you've been living with him, which means you forfeited your right to the house months ago." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by the sound that might have been laughter. "Sarah, honey, you always were too naive for your own good, just like your father. David thought he was so clever with his little conditions and restrictions, but dead men can't enforce contracts." Detective Martinez's eyebrows shot up at Patricia's casual admission. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus pressed. "I mean that David is gone and I'm very much alive. I've spent 5 years building a life for myself, and I'm not about to let some grieving girl and her bargain basement lawyer destroy everything I've worked for." "Patricia," I said, my voice stronger now, "we found Dad's workshop. We found his letters. We know about the private investigator." This time the silence stretched so long that I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the artificial warmth she'd always used with me, replaced with something cold and calculating. "I don't know anything, Sarah. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, but all you found are the paranoid fantasies of a sick man. Your father was losing his mind in those final weeks. The stress of his failing business, his heart problems, his guilt over your mother's abandonment. He was seeing threats that didn't exist." "His business wasn't failing," I shot back. "The financial records show he was more successful than ever."
Patricia's laugh was sharp and bitter. Financial records can be manipulated, sweetheart. Numbers can be made to say anything you want them to say. But let me tell you what really happened in those final months. Your father became obsessed with the idea that I was somehow using him. He hired that ridiculous private investigator, started hiding money, began making wild accusations about my past relationships. It was heartbreaking to watch such a good man deteriorate that way. So you're claiming Dad was mentally ill?
I'm saying David was under tremendous stress, and it affected his judgment. The chest pains he was experiencing weren't just physical. They were anxiety attacks brought on by his own paranoid delusions. I tried to get him to see a doctor, but he refused. He was convinced that everyone was plotting against him. Detective Martinez was taking notes furiously, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. Patricia was providing her defense strategy in real time, trying to discredit Dad's evidence by claiming he was mentally unstable. "Patricia," I said, "if Dad was so paranoid and unstable, why didn't you mention any of this to me after he died? Why did you let me believe he just had a sudden heart attack?" "Because I was trying to protect your memory of him." Patricia's voice rose, taking on the wounded tone she'd used so effectively over the years. "I didn't want you to remember your father as a broken man who'd lost his grip on reality. I thought it was kinder to let you believe he died peacefully." "How convenient," Detective Martinez interjected. "Miss Holloway, this is Detective Ray Martinez with the Portland Police Department. I'm going to need you to come in for questioning regarding several irregularities in your late husband's estate." The silence that followed was absolute. I could almost hear Patricia's mind racing, calculating her options. "I don't think that's necessary, Detective," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled again. "I'm planning to relocate to Arizona very soon to be with my family. If you have questions, you can direct them through my attorney." "Actually, Miss Holloway, I'm afraid your travel plans are going to have to wait. We're freezing all assets related to David Mitchell's estate pending a full investigation. That includes the proceeds from any property sales." "You can't do that." Patricia's facade cracked slightly. "I have rights. I have legal ownership." "Your legal ownership is being challenged based on evidence that you violated the conditions of your inheritance. Until this matter is resolved, no assets can be transferred." "This is harassment," she hissed. "I'll sue every one of you for interfering with a legitimate business transaction." "You're welcome to try," Detective Martinez replied. "In the meantime, I strongly suggest you remain in Portland and make yourself available for questioning. Attempting to leave the jurisdiction while under investigation would not look good for you." The call ended abruptly, leaving us in tense silence. "Well," Detective Martinez said finally, "she just gave us several useful pieces of information. She admitted knowing about the conditions in the will, she acknowledged that your father had hired a private investigator, and she confirmed she's been living with Robert Carlucci. Most importantly, she revealed she's been planning to leave town, which suggests consciousness of guilt. But she also provided a defense strategy," Marcus pointed out. "If this goes to trial, she's going to claim David was mentally ill and that all his suspicions were paranoid delusions." Detective Martinez nodded grimly, "Which is why we need to build an airtight case. Sarah, I need you to prepare yourself for what comes next. Patricia is going to fight this with everything she has, and she's going to try to destroy your father's reputation in the process." Over the next few days, the investigation expanded rapidly. Detective Martinez coordinated with authorities in other states where Patricia had lived, uncovering a disturbing pattern. Her first husband, William Carver, had died of a heart attack at age 52, leaving her a house and substantial life insurance. Her second husband, Frank Holloway, had died of cardiac arrest at 48, also leaving significant assets. Both deaths had been ruled at the time, but the circumstances were remarkably similar to Dad's death.
Both men had been healthy before experiencing sudden cardiac problems. Both had been married to Patricia for less than 10 years, and both had left wills that heavily favored their young wife. We're coordinating with medical examiners in Colorado and Nevada to review those cases, Detective Martinez explained during one of our meetings. If we can establish a pattern of suspicious deaths, it strengthens our case significantly. But Patricia wasn't sitting idle while we built our case against her. 3 days after our phone call, Marcus received a letter from her attorney, a high-powered firm in Seattle, specializing in estate litigation. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, threatening to sue me for defamation, harassment, and emotional distress. It claimed that Patricia was the victim of a vindictive stepdaughter's baseless accusations and demanded that all investigations cease immediately. "They're trying to scare us off," Marcus explained as we reviewed the threatening letter. "This is standard procedure when someone has been caught in wrongdoing. Attack the accusers and try to make them back down." "Are they serious about suing me?" I asked, terrified at the thought of facing Patricia's expensive lawyers in court. "They might be, but it's also possible this is just intimidation. Either way, we can't let it stop us from pursuing the truth." The real blow came a week later when Detective Martinez called with disturbing news. "Sarah, Patricia and Robert Carlucci have disappeared," he said grimly. "Their neighbors say they packed up and left in the middle of the night 3 days ago. We've issued a BOLO alert, but they could be anywhere by now." My heart sunk. Patricia's flight was essentially an admission of guilt, but it also meant she might escape justice entirely. "There's more," Detective Martinez continued. "We got court approval for the exhumation, but when the cemetery crew went to prepare your father's grave this morning, they discovered something troubling. Someone had been there recently. The ground around the headstone had been disturbed, and there were signs that someone had been digging." The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. Patricia had somehow learned about the planned exhumation and had tried to tamper with Dad's grave. "Was she trying to access the coffin?" I asked, horrified. "We don't know yet, but we've moved up the exhumation schedule. The medical examiner is going to process your father's remains immediately before any more tampering can occur." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Patricia's desperation had revealed the truth more clearly than any evidence we had collected. Innocent people don't flee in the night or attempt to disturb graves. They don't hire expensive lawyers to intimidate grieving daughters or try to destroy evidence of their crimes. Patricia was guilty, and she knew it. The question now was whether we could catch her before she disappeared forever.
The exhumation of my father's body was scheduled for dawn on a gray Thursday morning in April. I hadn't slept in 3 days, alternating between rage at Patricia's crimes and overwhelming grief at the thought of disturbing Dad's final rest. Jessica stayed with me the night before, making endless cups of tea while I paced my tiny apartment like a caged animal. "You don't have to be there," she kept saying. "Marcus and the detective can handle everything." But I knew I had to witness this myself. Dad had spent his final weeks trying to protect me from Patricia's deception. The least I could do was be present when we finally sought the truth he died trying to expose. Restwood Cemetery at 6 a.m. was shrouded in morning fog, giving the place an otherworldly atmosphere that made everything feel like a nightmare. Detective Martinez met me at the entrance, his expression grim. "Sarah, before we begin, I need to prepare you for what we might find," he said carefully. "When Patricia tampered with the gravesite, she may have been trying to plant evidence or remove something incriminating. The scene might be disturbing." Marcus arrived with Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the medical examiner who would be analyzing Dad's remains. She was a small, precise woman with kind eyes who explained the process in gentle terms that somehow made it feel less violating. "We'll be looking for traces of digitalis or other cardiac medications that shouldn't be present," Dr. Harper explained as we walked toward Dad's grave.
If your father was poisoned, there should still be detectable residues in his hair and bone tissue. The gravesite was worse than I had imagined. What should have been a peaceful resting place looked like a construction zone. The perfectly manicured grass had been torn up in rough patches, and there were clear signs that someone had been digging frantically in the dark. Tools had been abandoned nearby, a small shovel, a flashlight, and most disturbing of all, a plastic container that appeared to contain some kind of chemical solution. She was definitely here, Detective Martinez said, photographing everything. And she was in a hurry. Look at this. He pointed to what appeared to be fresh tire tracks in the soft earth nearby, suggesting Patricia had driven right up to the gravesite despite cemetery regulations. As the cemetery crew began the formal exhumation process, I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Dad. It had been the night before he died, and he'd called me at college just to say he loved me. "I'm proud of the woman you're becoming, Sarah. No matter what happens, remember that everything I've done has been to secure your future." At the time, I thought it was just one of his sentimental moments. Now I realized he'd been saying goodbye. Dr. Harper's preliminary examination revealed something that made my blood run cold. The coffin seal had been broken recently, not by natural deterioration, but by deliberate tampering. Someone had opened Dad's coffin and disturbed his remains. "This is highly unusual," Dr. Harper said quietly. "It appears someone attempted to introduce foreign substances into the gravesite, possibly to contaminate any toxicology evidence." Detective Martinez was taking photographs of everything, his expression growing darker by the minute. Patricia knew we were getting close. This was her attempt to destroy evidence of the poisoning. But Patricia's desperate midnight grave robbing may have backfired. In her panic to contaminate the evidence, she'd left behind clear signs of her presence, including fingerprints on the abandoned tools and what appeared to be strands of auburn hair caught on the cemetery fence. The toxicology analysis would take weeks, but Dr. Harper was confident that Patricia's tampering hadn't been thorough enough to destroy all evidence of poisoning if it existed. As we left the cemetery, I felt emotionally destroyed. Seeing Dad's grave desecrated, knowing that Patricia had violated his final resting place in a desperate attempt to cover her crimes, was almost more than I could bear. But worse news was waiting at Marcus's office. Patricia's high-powered legal team had filed a restraining order against me, claiming I was harassing her client with baseless accusations motivated by greed. The order prohibited me from discussing the case publicly, from contacting any of Patricia's associates, and from accessing any property she claimed to own. "This is a strategic move," Marcus explained, but his confidence seemed shaken. "They're trying to silence you while they build their defense." "Can they do that? Can they legally stop me from talking about my own father's murder?" "The restraining order is temporary, but it complicates our situation. If you violate its terms, they can have you arrested, and it sends a message to potential witnesses that getting involved in this case could result in legal consequences for them too." The psychological warfare was working. Over the next few days, several people who had promised to provide testimony about Patricia's suspicious behavior began backing out. Dad's former coworkers at Brennan Electric suddenly became unavailable for interviews. Neighbors who had initially been eager to share their observations about Patricia's relationship with Robert Carlucci now claimed they didn't want to get involved. Even worse, the media attention was becoming a nightmare. Someone had leaked details of the case to a local tabloid, which ran a sensationalized story portraying me as a money-hungry stepdaughter trying to destroy a grieving widow's reputation. The article included a photo of me looking disheveled outside the courthouse, with a headline that read, "Dead Father's Will Sparks Ugly Family Feud."
Patricia's lawyers had clearly orchestrated the media coverage, feeding the reporter a narrative that painted her as the victim and me as the aggressor. The story included quotes from family friends who described Patricia as devastated by my cruel accusations and desperate attempts to steal her rightfully inherited property. The public reaction was swift and brutal. My social media accounts were flooded with messages calling me everything from a gold digger to a psychopath. Strangers felt entitled to judge my relationship with my father based on a tabloid article, and their comments were vicious. "You should be ashamed of yourself," one message read. "Your poor stepmother took care of you after your real mother abandoned you, and this is how you repay her kindness? Disgusting." Another commenter wrote, "Classic case of an entitled brat who can't accept that daddy didn't leave her everything. Grow up and get a job instead of trying to steal from the woman who loved him." The psychological toll was devastating. I started doubting everything. My memories of Patricia's behavior, my interpretation of Dad's letters, even my own motives for pursuing the case. What if I really was just a greedy stepdaughter who couldn't accept that Dad had chosen to provide for his wife? What if his suspicions about Patricia had been paranoid delusions brought on by stress and illness? The doubt was poisonous, eating away at my confidence and resolve. I found myself crying at random moments, unable to concentrate on work, jumping at every unexpected sound. Jessica was worried enough to suggest I see a therapist. "This is exactly what they want," she said one evening as I sat staring at my laptop screen, paralyzed by the latest wave of online harassment. "They're trying to break you down psychologically so you'll give up the fight." But the breaking point came when I received a package at my apartment with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Dad's gravesite after the exhumation, with a handwritten note attached. "This is what happens to people who don't know when to quit." The threat was clear, and it terrified me. Patricia and Robert were still out there somewhere, monitoring the case and my actions. They knew where I lived, and they weren't above intimidation tactics to protect themselves. That night, I called Marcus in tears, ready to surrender. "I can't do this anymore," I sobbed into the phone. "Maybe I was wrong about everything. Maybe Patricia really did love Dad, and I'm just a bitter daughter who can't accept the truth. Maybe I should just let her keep the house and try to move on with my life." Marcus was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Sarah, I understand why you're feeling this way. Patricia's legal team is very good at psychological warfare, and they've been systematically undermining your confidence. But I want you to remember something. Innocent people don't flee in the middle of the night. They don't tamper with graves. They don't hire expensive lawyers to intimidate their accusers." "But what if the evidence doesn't prove anything? What if Dad really was just paranoid and I'm destroying an innocent woman's life based on the delusions of a sick man?" "Then the toxicology report will show that and we'll know the truth. But Sarah, you have to see this through, not just for yourself, but for your father. He spent his final weeks trying to protect you from exactly what's happening now. Don't let Patricia destroy his efforts by convincing you to give up when we're so close to the truth." After hanging up, I sat in my dark apartment feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, but my world had become a nightmare of legal threats, public humiliation, and psychological manipulation. I thought about Dad working in his shop during those final weeks, carefully documenting Patricia's behavior and planning for my protection. He'd known this fight would be difficult, but he trusted me to see it through. The question was, did I have the strength to honor that trust? Or would Patricia's campaign of intimidation succeed in silencing the truth forever? As I finally fell into an exhausted sleep, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would either find the courage to continue fighting, or I would surrender and let Patricia win. But either way, this psychological torture had to end.
I woke up the next morning with a strange sense of clarity. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was finally accepting that I had nothing left to lose. But something had shifted during the night. As I made coffee in my tiny kitchen, I found myself thinking not about Patricia's intimidation tactics or the public harassment, but about the man my father had been. Dad had never backed down from a fight when he believed in something. When the city tried to tear down the community center where I'd learned to play basketball, he'd organized the entire neighborhood to oppose it. When his employer tried to shortchange workers on overtime pay, he'd been the one to contact the labor board. He taught me that doing the right thing was rarely easy, but it was always worth it. Integrity isn't about being perfect, Sarah, he'd told me once when I was struggling with whether to report a classmate for cheating. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you something. The phone rang as I was getting dressed for work, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus, and his voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard in weeks. Sarah, you need to get down to my office immediately. We just received a call that changes everything. 30 minutes later, I sat across from Marcus and a woman I'd never met before. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. Her name was Dorothy Brennan, and she owned the electrical company where Dad had worked. I should have come forward sooner, Dorothy said, her voice heavy with regret. But when I saw that newspaper article painting Patricia as the victim, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Dorothy explained that she'd been Dad's boss for over 15 years, and she'd watched Patricia's behavior at company events with growing concern. Your father was one of my best employees, honest, reliable, skilled at his job. But in those final months, he became increasingly worried about something at home. He started asking me about our employee assistance program, whether we provided counseling for marital problems. What kind of marital problems? Marcus asked, taking notes. David was suspicious about money going missing from their joint account. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. He also mentioned that Patricia had been pressuring him to change his life insurance beneficiary and update his will. My heart pounded. This was exactly the kind of testimony we needed to establish Patricia's pattern of manipulation. But here's what really concerned me, Dorothy said. About 2 months before David died, Patricia started showing up at the office frequently. She'd bring him lunch, hang around the break room, chat with other employees. At first, it seemed sweet, a wife being attentive to her husband. But I noticed she was asking a lot of questions about our health insurance, disability benefits, and especially our life insurance policies. She was researching the benefits Dad would leave behind, I said, the pieces falling into place. That's what I suspected, but I didn't want to interfere in their marriage. I should have said something to David, but... Dorothy's voice trailed off, and I could see the guilt in her eyes. Marcus leaned forward. Dorothy, is there anything else you can tell us about Patricia's behavior during that time? Actually, yes. After David's funeral, Patricia came to the office to collect his personal belongings, but instead of just taking his tools and photos, she spent a long time going through his desk, looking through files and paperwork. She seemed particularly interested in the employee handbook and benefits information. Did she take anything besides his personal items? That's the strange part. She took several company forms, including blank insurance claim paperwork and workers' compensation documentation. When I asked her about it, she said she needed them for estate purposes, but it never made sense to me. Dorothy's testimony was devastating to Patricia's defense, but she had more to share. There's something else, she said, reaching into her purse. I found this in David's desk after Patricia's visit. She must have missed it. She handed me a small notebook in David's handwriting. The pages contained detailed records of his daily activities, including times, dates, and observations about Patricia's behavior. It was essentially a diary documenting his growing suspicions about his wife. The entries painted a picture of a man slowly realizing he'd been targeted by a predator. March 15th. Patricia asked again about changing life insurance beneficiary. Says I don't trust her. Found her going through my filing cabinet when I came home early from work. March 22nd. Money missing from checking account again. $300 this time? Patricia claims she withdrew it for household expenses but can't produce receipts. March 28th. Caught Patricia on phone with someone discussing timeline and arrangements. When she saw me, she hung up quickly and claimed it was her book club. April 2nd. Feeling chest pains more frequently. Patricia insists I take the heart medication she bought me, but I never told her about the chest pains. How did she know? The final entry, dated just 3 days before Dad's death, was the most chilling. April 10th. Found Digitalis tablets hidden in Patricia's makeup bag. I don't have a prescription for Digitalis, and she knows I'm not taking any heart medication. Why does she have cardiac drugs? Consulting with lawyer tomorrow about protecting Sarah's inheritance. The notebook was the smoking gun we'd been looking for. Dad had documented Patricia's suspicious behavior right up until his death, and he'd discovered she was in possession of the very drug that could have killed him. Dorothy, why didn't you come forward with this sooner? Marcus asked gently. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Because I was scared. After David died so suddenly, and then seeing how Patricia handled everything so efficiently, I started wondering if maybe I'd been imagining things. When that newspaper article came out making Sarah look like the villain, I realized I'd been a coward. David was a good man, and if someone murdered him, they shouldn't get away with it. With Dorothy's testimony and Dad's notebook, our case was transformed. But the most dramatic development came later that afternoon when Detective Martinez called with urgent news. "Sarah, we got them," he said, barely containing his excitement. "Patricia and Robert Carlucci were arrested this morning in Las Vegas. They were trying to board a flight to Mexico using fake passports." The arrests had yielded a treasure trove of evidence. In their hotel room, police found Patricia's laptop containing emails detailing her relationship with Robert, financial records showing how she'd been systematically hiding Dad's assets, and most damning of all, research she'd conducted on undetectable methods of poisoning. She'd been planning this for months, Detective Martinez explained when I met him at the station. The emails show she was corresponding with Robert while your father was still alive, discussing their plans to be together permanently once certain obstacles were removed. One email, sent just weeks before Dad's death, was particularly incriminating. "My dear Robert, everything is proceeding according to plan. D has been taking his medication regularly and showing all the expected symptoms. The private investigator he hired is a concern, but I've made arrangements to handle any complications. Soon we'll have everything we need to start our new life together." The toxicology results came back yesterday, Detective Martinez continued. Your father had lethal levels of Digitalis in his system, enough to cause the cardiac arrest that killed him. There's no question he was murdered. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with profound sadness. Dad had spent his final weeks knowing he was in danger, trying to protect me while slowly being poisoned by the woman he trusted with his life. But there was more evidence to come. Robert Carlucci, faced with murder charges, had decided to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a plea deal. His confession revealed the full scope of Patricia's crimes. "She's done this before," Detective Martinez explained. Robert confirmed that Patricia murdered both of her previous husbands using the same method. She'd research their finances, marry them, then slowly poison them while appearing to be the devoted wife. Robert was supposed to be her partner for the next phase. They'd planned to target wealthy widowers in retirement communities across the Southwest. The investigation also revealed how Patricia had managed to hide Dad's assets so effectively. She'd been transferring money to accounts under Robert's name for months before Dad died, systematically looting their joint finances while Dad was focused on his work and his growing health problems. "We've recovered most of the stolen assets," Detective Martinez said. "The rental properties, the investment accounts, even the proceeds from the house sale that got frozen. Your father was worth significantly more than Patricia admitted, and all of it should rightfully come to you." As I sat in Detective Martinez's office, surrounded by evidence of Patricia's calculated cruelty, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also profound grief for the father I'd lost to such a senseless crime.
Dad had known he was in danger, but he'd chosen to stay and fight rather than flee because he wanted to protect my future. "There's one more thing," Detective Martinez said, handing me a sealed envelope. "Robert told us that Patricia kept a detailed journal of her crimes. She was proud of what she'd accomplished, thought she was too smart to ever get caught. This is a copy. It contains her confessions to multiple murders, including your father's." I stared at the envelope, knowing it contained the final proof of Patricia's guilt, but unsure I was ready to read her own words describing how she'd murdered Dad. "You don't have to read it now," Marcus said gently, "but it's important evidence, and it might help you understand what really happened during those final weeks." As we left the police station, I realized that everything had changed again. Just days ago, I'd been ready to give up, convinced that maybe I was wrong about Patricia's guilt. Now I had absolute proof, not only that Dad had been murdered, but that his killer had been systematically stealing from our family for years. The truth was finally coming to light, but I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Patricia would have to face trial for her crimes, and I would have to testify about the impact of her deception on my life. But for the first time in months, I felt strong enough to see this through to the end. Dad had trusted me to seek justice for his murder, and I wasn't going to let him down.
Patricia's arraignment was scheduled for a Monday morning in late May, and I knew I had to be there. Not because I was required to testify, that would come later during the trial, but because I needed to look her in the eye and show her that her intimidation tactics had failed. The courthouse was buzzing with media attention. Word had leaked about Patricia's serial killer pattern, and suddenly the story had transformed from a family feud into a true crime sensation. Reporters crowded the steps, and I could see camera crews setting up for live broadcasts. Marcus met me at the courthouse entrance, along with Jessica, who had taken the day off work to provide moral support. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked as we made our way through the crowd of reporters. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. I've been ready for months. I just want to see her face when she realizes her lies haven't worked. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and legal officials. When the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Morrison," the room fell into absolute silence. Judge Morrison was known for her no-nonsense approach to serious crimes, and her reputation for fairness had given me hope that justice would be served. Then the side door opened, and Patricia walked in, flanked by her defense team. I hadn't seen her since before Dad's death, and the change was shocking. Gone was the carefully maintained appearance she'd always cultivated. Her auburn hair had grown out, showing gray roots, and she looked like she had lost significant weight during her weeks in custody. But what struck me most was her posture. She no longer carried herself with the confident superiority that had defined her personality. She looked diminished, almost fragile. As she took her seat at the defendant's table, her eyes swept the courtroom and landed on me. For just a moment, our gazes met, and I saw something I'd never seen in Patricia before. Genuine fear. The arraignment itself was brief but dramatic. The prosecutor, District Attorney Helen Rodriguez, read the charges in a clear, steady voice that made each accusation sound like a death sentence. "Patricia Ann Holloway, also known as Patricia Mitchell, you are charged with first-degree murder in the death of David Mitchell, conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of estate assets exceeding $400,000, identity fraud, obstruction of justice, and tampering with a grave site." Patricia's lawyer, James Whitfield, entered a plea of not guilty to all charges, but his confidence seemed forced. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Judge Morrison set bail at $2 million, citing Patricia as an extreme flight risk given her recent attempt to flee the country. Patricia's face went pale when she realized she would remain in custody until trial. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed us with questions. Marcus had coached me on how to handle media attention, and I gave a brief statement. My father, David Mitchell, was a good man who worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. He deserves justice, and I'm grateful that the legal system is working to ensure his killer is held accountable for her crimes. But the real work was just beginning.
Over the following weeks, Marcus and I worked with District Attorney Rodriguez to prepare for what would likely be a high-profile trial. Patricia's defense team was already mounting an aggressive campaign to discredit the evidence and portray her as the victim of circumstantial accusations. The first challenge came when Patricia's lawyers filed a motion to suppress Dad's notebook, arguing that it was hearsay evidence since he wasn't alive to testify about its contents. They claimed the notebook could have been fabricated or altered, and that admitting it as evidence would violate Patricia's right to confront her accusers. This is a standard defense tactic, DA Rodriguez explained during one of our preparation meetings. They're trying to exclude the most damaging evidence against their client, but we have strong arguments for why the notebook should be admissible. The suppression hearing took place 3 weeks after the arraignment, and it felt like the entire case hung in the balance. If we lost the notebook evidence, Patricia's lawyers would have successfully undermined the foundation of our case.
When the ruling came, it was a complete victory. Judge Morrison not only allowed the notebook as evidence, but issued a stinging rebuke to the defense's claims about Dad's mental state. The court finds that David Mitchell's notebook entries demonstrate clear, rational thinking and consistent attention to detail, she wrote in her opinion. The defendant's characterization of these writings as paranoid delusions is not supported by the evidence. Mr. Mitchell's observations about his wife's behavior were subsequently validated by the discovery of digitalis in her possession and her attempt to flee prosecution. With the notebook evidence secure, DA Rodriguez's case gained tremendous strength. But Patricia's defense team wasn't giving up. They filed motion after motion, each one designed to delay the trial and create reasonable doubt about their client's guilt. The most disturbing development came when Whitfield announced that Patricia would be claiming battered wife syndrome as her defense. According to this strategy, Patricia had been the victim of psychological and financial abuse by Dad, and any actions she took were in self-defense. "This is obscene," I told Marcus when we learned about the defense strategy. "Dad was the gentlest man I've ever known. He never raised his voice, never showed any signs of controlling behavior. How can they claim he was abusive?" "Because it's one of the few defenses available to someone caught red-handed committing murder," Marcus replied grimly. "They're going to paint your father as a controlling husband who threatened Patricia's safety, forcing her to defend herself." The battered wife defense required Patricia's lawyers to present evidence of Dad's supposed abuse, which led to one of the most painful aspects of the pretrial period. They subpoenaed everyone who had known Dad, looking for any incident that could be twisted to support their narrative. They interviewed my college friends, hoping to find evidence that Dad had been overprotective or controlling. They contacted his co-workers, fishing for stories about his temper or domineering behavior. They even spoke to neighbors from our old street, trying to uncover any domestic disputes or signs of marital tension. The fishing expedition backfired spectacularly. Every single person they interviewed described Dad as kind, generous, and devoted to his family. His co-workers spoke about his patience and professionalism. Neighbors remembered him as the guy who helped everyone with electrical problems and never asked for payment. "They're actually helping our case," DA Rodriguez observed after reviewing the defense team's interview summaries. "Every person they talk to reinforces your father's reputation as a gentle, caring man. It's going to be impossible for them to convince a jury that he was an abusive husband." But the defense team's most desperate gambit came when they tried to claim that I was the real mastermind behind Dad's murder. According to this theory, I had manipulated Patricia into killing Dad so I could inherit his estate, then turned on her to avoid prosecution myself. "This is their Hail Mary pass," Marcus explained when we learned about this new strategy. "When the evidence is overwhelming, some defense attorneys will throw out wild theories, hoping something sticks with the jury." The accusation that I had orchestrated my own father's murder was so outrageous that it almost felt surreal. But I knew it was also dangerous. If even one juror believed their story, Patricia could escape conviction. Fortunately, the prosecution had evidence that completely demolished this theory.
Dad's notebook clearly showed he was investigating Patricia's behavior on his own initiative, not at my suggestion. The timeline of events proved I had been away at college for most of the suspicious incidents, and my phone records showed minimal contact with Patricia during Dad's final weeks. More importantly, Robert Carlucci's confession had revealed that Patricia was the sole architect of the murder plot. In his detailed statement to police, Robert described how Patricia had recruited him as her partner, not how she had been manipulated by someone else. As the trial date approached, I felt increasingly confident about our chances for conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, Patricia's defense strategies were failing, and public opinion had turned decisively against her. But I also knew that Patricia was a skilled manipulator who had successfully deceived people for years. If anyone could find a way to convince a jury of her innocence, it would be her. The trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, and I spent those final days preparing for what would likely be the most difficult experience of my life. I would have to testify about Dad's death, Patricia's deception, and the impact of her crimes on my life. But I was ready. Dad had spent his final weeks fighting to protect me from Patricia's schemes, documenting her crimes even as she slowly poisoned him. The least I could do was honor his courage by seeing this battle through to the end. Patricia had underestimated the strength of the evidence against her, and she had underestimated my determination to seek justice for Dad's murder. Soon, she would face the consequences of those miscalculations.
The trial of Patricia Holloway began on a sweltering Monday morning in July. The courthouse was surrounded by news vans and curious onlookers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. "Black Widow Trial Begins," screamed the headlines, and social media buzzed with speculation about the woman who had allegedly murdered 3 husbands for their money. I sat in the front row, behind the prosecution table, flanked by Jessica and Dorothy Brennan, who had become an unexpected source of strength throughout this ordeal. As the jury filed into the courtroom, I studied their faces, wondering if these 12 strangers would finally deliver the justice Dad deserved. District Attorney Rodriguez's opening statement was masterful, laying out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity. She walked the jury through Patricia's pattern of targeting vulnerable men, described the systematic poisoning of my father, and explained how Patricia had tried to cover her tracks by stealing his assets and fleeing the country. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez concluded, "this case is about the calculated murder of a good man by a woman who saw him not as a husband, but as a victim. David Mitchell trusted Patricia with his life, his home, and his family. She repaid that trust by slowly poisoning him while stealing everything he had worked for." Patricia's defense attorney, James Whitfield, delivered a desperate opening that attempted to portray his client as the real victim. He claimed Patricia had been driven to desperation by Dad's alleged financial abuse and controlling behavior, painting her as a woman who had acted in self-defense rather than greed. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against Patricia was overwhelming. The prosecution called witness after witness who testified to Dad's gentle character and Patricia's suspicious behavior during their marriage. Dorothy Brennan's testimony was particularly powerful. She described Patricia's frequent visits to the electrical company, her unusual interest in employee benefits, and her strange behavior after Dad's death. When Whitfield tried to cross-examine her, suggesting she was biased against Patricia, Dorothy's response silenced the courtroom. "Mr. Whitfield, I've been in business for 30 years. I've seen every kind of person you can imagine. But I've never seen someone attend their spouse's workplace so frequently while asking so many questions about death benefits. That's not the behavior of a loving wife. That's the behavior of someone planning for their husband's death." The Matbill testimony was equally devastating. Dr. Harper explained how digitalis poisoning worked, describing how Patricia had likely been giving Dad small doses over several weeks, gradually weakening his heart until the final, fatal dose triggered cardiac arrest. The levels of digitalis found in Mr. Mitchell's remains were consistent with deliberate poisoning.
Dr. Harper testified. This wasn't an accidental overdose or a suicide. Someone with knowledge of cardiac medications systematically administered lethal doses over an extended period. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played recordings of Patricia's phone calls from jail. Unknown to her, all inmate calls were recorded, and Patricia had made the fatal error of discussing her case with Robert Carlucci during their brief time in adjacent holding cells. The recordings revealed Patricia's true personality, cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse for her crimes. In one particularly damning conversation, she complained about the ungrateful brat who had ruined everything by investigating Dad's death. I gave that girl a home for years. I could have thrown her out when David died, but I let her believe she was part of the family. And this is how she repays me? By trying to destroy my life over some paranoid nonsense her father wrote in a notebook? The jury's faces showed visible disgust as they listened to Patricia dismiss Dad's murder as paranoid nonsense and complain about my ingratitude for not accepting his death quietly. When it came time for Patricia to testify in her own defense, her performance was a disaster. Whitfield had clearly coached her extensively, but Patricia's narcissistic personality made it impossible for her to maintain the victim persona they were trying to create. Under direct examination, she attempted to portray herself as a loving wife who had been driven to desperation by Dad's alleged abuse and controlling behavior. But when DA Rodriguez began her cross-examination, Patricia's mask slipped completely. Miss Holloway, you've testified that you felt threatened by your husband's behavior. Can you explain why you never sought help from domestic violence resources during your 7-year marriage? I was afraid he would find out. But you had no problem researching cardiac medications online, did you? Patricia's face flushed. I don't know what you're talking about. Rodriguez produced printouts of Patricia's internet search history, recovered from her laptop. The searches painted a chilling picture of premeditation. Digitalis overdose symptoms, undetectable heart attack causes. How long does Digitalis stay in system after death? These searches were conducted over 6 months before your husband's death, Rodriguez continued relentlessly. Can you explain why a woman afraid for her safety was researching ways to cause untraceable heart attacks? Patricia's composure cracked completely. You're twisting everything, she shouted, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. David was paranoid and controlling. He was going to leave me with nothing.
So, you killed him first, Rodriguez stated matter-of-factly. I defended myself, Patricia screamed, rising from her chair before Whitfield could stop her. He was going to destroy me. I had every right to protect my future. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Patricia's outburst revealed her true motive. She hadn't killed Dad in self-defense. She had murdered him to prevent him from discovering her crimes and changing his will. Whitfield desperately tried to repair the damage during redirect examination, but Patricia's explosive admission had demolished any hope of reasonable doubt. The jury had seen her true nature, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. The prosecution's closing argument was brief but powerful. Rodriguez simply replayed Patricia's recorded jail conversations and reminded the jury of her courtroom outburst. Patricia Holloway has told you exactly who she is. She's a woman who views marriage as a business transaction and murder as a business strategy. David Mitchell's only crime was trusting her with his life. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the forewoman's voice was steady and clear. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of David Mitchell, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty seemed to echo in the courtroom long after it was spoken. Patricia's face went white, and she slumped in her chair as if the reality of her situation was finally sinking in. I felt tears streaming down my face, not tears of joy, but tears of profound relief that Dad's killer would finally face consequences for her actions. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the additional charges were resolved quickly. Patricia pleaded guilty to fraud, theft, and obstruction of justice in exchange for concurrent sentences. Robert Carlucci, who had testified against her as part of his plea agreement, received 15 years for conspiracy. At Patricia's sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to read a victim impact statement. As I stood at the podium facing the woman who had destroyed my family, I thought about everything Dad had taught me about strength, integrity, and fighting for what's right. Patricia, I began, my voice stronger than I had expected. You didn't just murder my father. You stole 5 years of my life by convincing me I had no right to question your lies. You made me doubt my own memories, my own worth, my own father's love for me. I looked directly into her eyes as I continued. But you made one crucial mistake. You underestimated the power of truth, and you underestimated the strength my father gave me to fight for that truth. Because of your crimes, I learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. Judge Morrison sentenced Patricia to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, she looked back at me one final time. The superior, manipulative woman who had terrorized my family was gone, replaced by a broken figure facing the rest of her life behind bars. In the months that followed, I slowly began rebuilding my life with the assets Dad had left me. The house on Maple Street needed extensive renovation after years of Patricia's changes, but I was determined to restore it to the warm, welcoming home Dad had created. I used some of Dad's investment portfolio to finish my paralegal certification, and eventually started my own practice specializing in estate law and elder abuse cases. Every client who walked through my door received the fierce advocacy I wished I'd had during those first confused months after Dad's death. Dorothy Brennan became like a second mother to me, sharing stories about Dad's work and his dreams for my future. Through her, I learned that Dad had been secretly setting aside money for years to ensure I could buy my own home someday. Even while Patricia was stealing from him, he had been working extra jobs to secure my future. On the 5th anniversary of Dad's death and the 2nd anniversary of Patricia's conviction, I held a small memorial service in the restored garden behind the house. Jessica was there, along with Dorothy, Marcus, and Detective Martinez. We planted a tree in Dad's memory and shared stories about his kindness, his work ethic, and his unwavering love for his family. As the sun set behind the house Dad had worked so hard to provide, I felt a profound sense of peace. Justice had been served, his killer was behind bars, and his dreams for our family's future were finally being realized. Patricia had tried to erase Dad's legacy and steal my inheritance, but she had failed completely. The house was mine, the financial security he had worked for was restored, and most importantly, the truth about his character and his love for me had been vindicated. Standing in that garden, surrounded by people who had helped me fight for justice, I knew that Dad would be proud of the woman I'd become. His death had been a tragedy, but his life and his trust in me to seek the truth had ultimately triumphed over Patricia's cruelty and greed. The nightmare was finally over, and I was ready to build the future Dad had always wanted for me.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.